Hello, my name's Jemima Rhys-Evans and I'm the Deputy Head at Charles Dickens Primary School, which is in Southwark in South London, and I'm also Director of the Charles Dickens Research School. I'm going to be talking a bit about workload, a lot about marking and feedback, but also other aspects of workload. And I'm going to be talking about two main projects that I've been involved with. One ran from 2016 to 17, and that was the Workload Challenge project. And then more recently, a project that's run from 2019 to 2020 and still hasn't quite finished is a teaching school council project around supporting schools to use the teacher workload reduction toolkit. So those are the two projects I'm going to be talking about. I'm also going to be talking a bit about my experience in my school and the things that we've done to reduce teacher workload. So I'm going to start by taking you back in time to 2016 and the teacher workload survey. So this was the workload challenge when teachers were asked to identify which aspects of their workload were most overly burdensome. And these were the results. And you can see that we've got primary teachers here and secondary teachers here, and the responses were evenly split. And I think what's really interesting about this is how consistent the responses are, that we can see that the top three for both primary and secondary teachers are planning and resourcing, marking and feedback, and general admin. Now, general admin is a hard one to tackle without knowing the specifics and the details, but a lot of work has been done around planning and around marking and feedback. So those are some of the ones we're going to look at. Now, our journey at Charles Dickens on this really starting to think a bit more carefully about teacher workload came out of a meeting in spring 2016. We have a journal club. We try to meet once a term to discuss an article, a recent piece of research, a chapter from a book, a podcast, something from the TES, something from Impact Magazine. And in this occasion, we were talking about a marked improvement, which was the EEF's review of the evidence around written marking. And what was really interesting was that the almost unanimous response from the teachers with this sort of howl of frustration that they were absolutely sure from their professional experience and their professional judgment that the most effective form of feedback was sitting down next to a child and talking them through what they'd done and what they needed to do to get better. But that marking policies, requirements for detailed written marking with children responding to feedback made that really, really difficult for them. Furthermore, when we explored this, the publication, one of the key messages was that the quality of the evidence on written marking was really low. And that sort of compounded the insult, really, that teachers were doing something that they didn't think was having an impact. And there was no evidence base, there was no good reason why they were doing it. And at the same time, just a little bit earlier, the government had published, in response to the Workload Challenge surveys, the report of the Working Party around marking, eliminating unnecessary workload around marking. And if you haven't come across it, I really, really recommend it. It's a really strong piece of work, really clear, really short, really concise, really direct. And this is a particularly clear piece of messaging. Marking practice that does not have the desired impact on pupil outcomes is a time-wasting burden for teachers that has to stop. So really clear messaging. So we had the survey, then we had these reports, and we had a sense of what teachers felt in our context. And then the next step was with the research projects. So the National College announced, or was funded through the Department for Education, was funding schools and groups of schools to conduct research into the three key areas of workload that had come out of the surveys. That was marking and feedback, planning, and data and assessment. And Charles Dickens were involved with other schools in Southwark in a project that looked at the impact on pupil outcomes and teacher workload on removing written marking. So our project ran from December 2016 to July 2017. It was a short project, and the intervention itself ran from just after the February half term to the May half term. And that was because we needed to spend most of January and February training both the teachers and the pupils so that they would be ready for a change in practice, and really making sure everything was in place. And then from May half term onwards was the evaluation. So 2 half terms was the intervention. We had 5 primary schools in Southwark for whom we had data, but we had other schools that sort of joined us for part of the journey. We had a few other primary schools who had to sort of drop out halfway through, jury service, maternity leave. And we had a couple of secondaries, which was fascinating, but we actually found the data reporting for that too tricky. So they did the intervention, but we can't report that. We don't have quantitative data. We've got qualitative data only for them. And we measured the impact through entry and exit teacher questionnaires, which both asked teachers to log the number of hours they were doing on different types of feedback and marking, but also their perceptions of that, their perceptions of the usefulness of that, and the proportionality of that in terms of part of their working week. And then we measured the impact on pupil outcomes through entry and exit maths tests, giving us age standardised scores, and quite heavily moderated writing assessment. Each school had 2 intervention classes and 2 control classes, and although these weren't randomised, because we really wanted to take teachers along with us, and we needed those teachers who were going to be receptive to change and to trying something new. And then the project was externally evaluated by the UCL Institute of Education. And teachers replaced written marking with absolutely no distance written marking with 4 alternative strategies: self and peer assessment, whole class feedback, live marking, and verbal feedback and conferencing. Now, I'm not going to go into those practical strategies right now, but we did write a short book, which is the sort of the how-to guide, the practical version. We've got the academic evaluation of the research, but we've also got this booklet, Mark Less, Mark Better. The title comes from that original EEF report, and that details the sort of the context and all the practical things you need to know if you want to make this change in your school, how to implement those strategies, the preconditions necessary, and also the implications, the things we hadn't thought of, and the knock-on effects on things like lesson planning, on work scrutinies and book looks, and also how we communicated with parents on that. This is available as a free download, and I think I've got the URL later on in the presentation. There are hard copies available as well. If you would like a hard copy, then just get in touch and we'll send one out, though not for a little while, not till we're back in school. And this is what we found. This was the impact of the project. So the impact on teacher workload, teachers in the intervention groups spent on average 4.5 hours per week less than on written marking than those on the control group. And they spent on average just over 6 hours per week less on written marking than they had prior to the intervention. So those were the headlines. I'll just let you have a little look at that, get your head around that. So this is before the intervention: number of hours on written marking, number of hours on verbal feedback. During the intervention, and then this is what the control group was doing as well. And again, there was a bit of cross-contamination from the control group. We did notice a few teachers in those groups reducing the amount of written marking they were doing as well. So there are lots of limitations around this, but I think we'll see there's a sort of a theme and a general picture that emerges from this and other projects that gives us a really interesting steer as to what's happening with workload around marking. And then here's the impact on pupil outcomes. So across the term, those 2 half terms overall, the intervention had no measurable impact on progress in writing or maths compared to control group data. We were a bit disappointed when we had that, but if we can reduce workload by over 6 hours a week and maintain standards, then flipping that, those teachers in the control group were doing all of that additional work for no return. as I'll go on to say, I think as we've refined this since 2017, we've refined our approach, as have the other schools in the project. And we feel that our feedback is now we're getting better and better at it, and we've refined the ways we're doing that. So this is the summary of what we found. So 5 primary schools in Southwark, replacing written marking with a range of live feedback strategies. The impact, reduced workload and no negative impact. Now, as I said, the National College worked with groups of schools across the country for this. We weren't the only group of schools doing these projects investigating aspects of workload. So the other schools and groups of schools that were investigating marking and feedback, we'll see a really strong theme emerging. So 15 primary schools in Wigan, very, very similar, replacing written feedback with a range of marking strategies, reduced workload, no negative impact on pupil outcomes. The Aquinas Trust, and this is interesting, we bring in secondary schools and a special school, replacing written marking with verbal feedback, reduced workload, no negative impact. Cheshire Vale, 3 secondary schools, replacing written marking with live feedback, reduced workload, no negative impact. And Flying High, nursery and primary schools, we see the same pattern. So although each of these were quite small scale projects, each with its own challenges and limitations, we can see a real theme and a real pattern emerging. This is the publication. You can click on that, I think. And that will take you through to the free download, or as I said, just get in touch if you'd like some hard copies. But it's all the practical strategies. So how do you do whole class feedback? What are the pitfalls of live marking? What are all the knock-on effects that it might have? So just get in touch if you'd like that. So we're going to move forward in time. That was 2016-17. The final reports were published in 2018. Then in 2019, the workload survey was repeated. And this visual shows us secondary teachers' responses. We can see some real positives and some slightly confusing things here. So if we look at the positives first, in 2016, 73% of secondary teachers thought they were doing too much planning, preparation, resourcing of lessons. And if we look at 3 years later, 2019, that's gone down to 39%. So really strong gains there. However, if we look at marking and feedback, we had 56% of teachers in 2016 saying they were doing too much of it, and that's gone up in 2019. So when we looked at the 2016 survey, we saw a real consistency between primary and secondary contexts, but that's starting to change. So real gains in secondaries around planning, but the burden of marking seems to be increasing. And if we compare that to what's happening in primary settings, we can see an improvement in the planning, not quite as dramatic as that of secondaries, but a reduction in terms of the numbers of teachers feeling that they're spending too much time planning and resourcing individual lessons. And similarly, a really strong reduction in the numbers of teachers feeling that they are spending too much time marking and correcting pupils' work. So it looks as though marking is really having a powerful impact. Reducing written marking is having a powerful impact on teacher workload in primary settings, as is planning. And then in secondaries, planning is having a huge impact, but there is maybe some work to do around marking. So we're now moving on to the second project, and this was a project around supporting teachers to use the Teacher Workload Reduction Toolkit. Now, if you're not familiar with the toolkit, I really recommend that you have a look at it. It's full of really useful tools. Just Google Teacher Workload Reduction Toolkit. It's not a thing of beauty. But really useful tools to identify workload issues in your context. So tools to run staff meetings, graphs, surveys. And once you've identified what those key bugbears are, and again, they might be different for different groups of people working in your schools. It might be different for NQTs, different for senior leaders, different for support staff, different for different departments. a whole range of tools and resources to support you with addressing that particular aspect of workload. So again, PowerPoints to run staff meetings and loads of case studies. And the case studies are great because you can find a context that most closely matches yours. So if you're a rural primary or an urban secondary, or from a high level of deprivation, or a coastal special school, or an affluent area, you can really find a context that matches yours, which might give you a sort of a best bets for what might work. So this was a project jointly run by the Teaching School Councils, the EDT and the Department for Education. We had 7 regions across the country, each of which recruited 6 schools, 3 primaries, 2 secondaries and 1 special school. The resources from the Workload Toolkit were used by individual schools to identify their focus. And so individual schools all chose which area on workload they were going to focus on. That wasn't determined externally at all. And they used those case studies to inform their approach. And measurements that we took for this project, which I've got to say isn't completely finished. I was working with schools from the South East and South London region, and our data set is completed, but I think at the moment we've got 22 out of the 42 schools have reported data. So there's more information to come. It's really sort of quite new and quite exciting information. So the measurements made were teacher time, how much time were teachers spending on the given tasks, teacher well-being, and a lot of that was measured either through the IPEP survey or through individually designed, schools designed their own surveys to evaluate teacher well-being, monitoring pupils' attainment and progress. And some schools collected pupil and teacher perception data through interviews and focus groups. And there's some really lovely quotes that we're going to look at a bit later on. So these are the outcomes so far. We can see here, yes, 22. So we've had 22 projects reporting back. And there has been a significant, though small, impact on teacher time. So the average time on targeted tasks has gone from approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes to less than 30 minutes per week. I'm assuming you can pause this if you want to look to spend a bit longer on a slide. So I'm just going to sort of rattle through. I hope that's okay. Here are the outcomes from the teacher wellbeing inventory from the International Personality Item Pool scales. Quite a small number. So we've got 16 studies that have used this again so far, more data to come. And you can see that on all of those measures, you can see that the intervention group is scoring more highly than the control group on different aspects of teacher well-being. Some quite small gaps, but a really big gap here, with far fewer teachers reporting that they feel that they're working too hard in the intervention group. Self-efficacy, also quite a large gap, but in general, a really positive picture around the impact of the workload projects on teacher wellbeing. So far, we've got 100 effect sizes from trials, year group replications, other quantitative analyses, some randomised control trials, and other structures of research as well. And in terms of measuring the impact on pupil attainment and progress, remember we were going on the hypothesis that it will do no harm. The vast majority of studies showed no negative effects. Overall attainment in participating schools improved during the treatment window. We've got more effects to add. This isn't a finished set of data, but giving us a really positive steer in terms of the impact of workload reduction strategies on pupil attainment and outcomes. And then we've got some really nice qualitative data around what some pupils have said and what some teachers have said. And I've taken these from schools that I was working with in the South East and South London. So, lovely quote, "You can't talk to a page of marking." That was what a pupil said. Live marking helps them to understand what they've done wrong. A pupil succinctly described the process as allowing him to go, aha. And that's from a project around live marking in English and history, and that's GCSE classes in the Beacon School in Folkestone, which is a specialist provision school, and that's with their highest attaining tier of pupils that they ran that intervention. Another nice quote, I'll let you read that for yourselves. And that's another marking project, live marking in English in a primary school. It's in St Andrews in Brighton. And some really nice reflections there about the impact that's had on the teacher, and how they are assessing writing differently, moving away from the sort of the slight straitjacket of a checklist towards a more holistic view of a piece of writing. I really like that because one of the things I warn against in the booklet with live marking is that there's a danger that if you're trying to get round to give feedback to all the children in the class, there's a danger that that feedback can become superficial. And these teachers have clearly avoided that. And actually, they've gone the other way, that their feedback has become far more meaningful, far more about how do I make this child a better writer rather than add in the missing full stops. So that's a really nice piece of feedback. And then the next one, this is from George Abbott School in Guildford, secondary school in Guildford, and they looked at collaborative planning in Key Stage 3 maths. Planning will look, when we look at the impact on attainment, very few schools looked at planning, and it's a really hard one to measure, especially in the given time frames. The way George Abbott did it was they spent the autumn term collaboratively planning schemes of work, which were then taught in the spring term. And then at the end of the spring term, they would have assessed the pupils and made comparisons with the previous year's cohort. And they didn't have that data, wasn't yet available at time of reporting. But we've got this, which is a really nice quote. So a real feeling that the planning improved, but we had unanticipated benefits as well around supporting newer colleagues, sharing experience, and we'll look a bit more at some of those as well. So these are the effect sizes on pupil attainment for each of the different aspects of workload that schools looked at in terms, and this is out of the 22 schools that have reported data so far. So quite a lot of schools looked at streamlining communication, changing the way they did meetings, looking at the way they do emails, and overwhelmingly a positive impact on pupil attainment, though obviously not exclusively. On data reporting, again, quite a positive picture. Lesson monitoring and observation, and this is one of the projects that one of our special schools did. They completely changed the way they did work scrutinies and performance management, and interesting to see that that's had a really powerful impact on pupil outcomes as well. And then more schools wanted to look at marking and feedback than any other aspect of data of workload. And you can see here, so anything to the right of that central line indicates a positive outcome. So 2 pages of that, and we've got some real outliers there as well, but an overwhelmingly positive picture. So I mentioned that not many schools did planning. George Abbott did, but we don't have their quantitative data yet. So there was also this, the Independent Teacher Workload Review Group around planning have also produced a report similar to the Eliminating Unnecessary Workload around marking, and it's well worth a look. Their key recommendations, well, here they are. And I would hope that that third bullet point should really be true for everything we do. And I think we have a real responsibility as school leaders to make sure that that's the case. And going back to the 2016-17 Workload Challenge project, some schools there did look at planning, and this is what they found. And I hope again you'll see the common theme, the common thread. So we've got collaborative planning in year group networks across a trust of primary schools, reduced workload, improved quality of planning, and improved subject knowledge. Now, those are really tricky things to measure. So we're really talking qualitative data here. Similarly with the Mead School, 3 primary schools, collaborative planning. But teachers felt very, and similarly with Whitley Bay High School, improved quality of planning. So we've reduced workload in all three of those projects, and a real feeling that teachers increased confidence, increased CPD, improved subject knowledge. Hard to quantify, but really, really strong, powerful feedback. And I'm coming back to the collaborative lesson planning at George Abbott because, as I say, not many schools looked at planning, and I think it is because it's so hard to quantify the impact. But they've looked at all of these unanticipated, unintended benefits, and I just wanted to go through these because I think they're all so powerful. And what a lot of the schools have reported back to us as being part of this project, and this is our Workload Toolkit project with the Teaching School Councils from this year, but it was the same message from 2017, is that addressing workload has changed the culture of the school. Schools have become far more collaborative places. There's far more room for professional dialogue. And that's partly to do with teachers focusing in on a particular aspect of their practice, but also around a sense that teachers are being trusted to make these changes. And I think those culture changes are as powerful in terms of teacher self-efficacy and teacher autonomy, and the collaborative nature of the work, which is encouraging teacher relatedness, are incredibly powerful in terms of job satisfaction. So yes, we're reducing workload, but also we're really increasing teacher job satisfaction. Oh, I've jumped the gun a bit. I was going to say a little bit about what we've done in Charles Dickens around planning and following that recommendation around having fully resourced schemes of work. So we've gone for a commercial scheme of work in Maths No Problem, but we've also put in place a fully resourced humanities curriculum. And we were a little trepidatious about this, about considerations on teacher autonomy. And so we've been really careful to keep those dialogues open and to check in with teachers about whether they feel the same thing. These are the benefits we found of the fully resourced schemes of work. They're planned by experts both within the school and externally. So our subject leads all have a degree in the subject that they're leading. But we've also reached out to secondary schools and been really, really well supported with secondary heads of department to help us, and through professional subject organisations like the Historical Association and Geographical Association. And that's meant that the learning has been really, really carefully sequenced to allow for a really strong sense of progression. We've seen improved pupil outcomes in terms of both their knowledge and their ability to apply that knowledge, either through arguments and discussion or through written work. We've supported vocabulary development by really explicitly mapping our Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary throughout our units. And teachers have reported to us improved subject knowledge. And this is really the big one, because as I say, we were a little bit worried about limiting teacher autonomy, but what teachers have said to us is actually they found it liberating. It's allowed them to focus on how they teach and not what they teach. They're not the subject specialists in this area. And so that's had a really positive impact as well. So we survey our team every year about workload, so I thought it'd be useful to share this as well. As with all schools, our teachers are incredibly hardworking, but we think we're getting there with workload. Most teachers in the blue and yellow bars reporting positively around their workload. And we think we know what the additional reasons are for some members of staff who are still struggling. And I think this is something we're really pleased about, and as it should be. What takes most of your time? And we've got teaching children as the biggest one, and that's where it should be. Preparing resources is the next biggest, and that's around adapting lesson plans in response to what's happened the day before. So looking at what's happened in maths, looking at what's happened in English, what extra bits and pieces do I need to put in place? And the reason teachers have time to do that is that they're not marking after the end of the school day. So I think I'm getting to the end. We've got other aspects of workload that I haven't mentioned, but I think are really worth considering. And we think have made a big impact on workload. And these are around reporting to parents, writing assessment. So do Google comparative judgment, no more marking if you don't use it. It's wonderful. Displays and meetings, so streamlining those. But the big message really is how reducing teacher workload goes really hand in hand with improving pupil outcomes. We have our planning is far more responsive. The planning is done by experts. Our feedback has got much better as well. Our parents really like the changes we've made to reporting and getting rid of some of the narrative blur and being far more focused about how well a child is doing in each particular area. The writing assessment is far more accurate. So workload going really hand in hand with improving pupil outcomes. And we think there's now an awful lot of data out there, a lot of research evidence to support that as a theory. So I hope that's been interesting. I hope it's been useful. Please do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. My email address is there, and my Twitter handle. I don't use Twitter very much, but I should do it more. So please do get in touch on Twitter. And that's the download link if you need it. But thank you very much for listening. And I hope you enjoy all the other amazing presentations from researchED Durrington. Thanks very much.